So last night, several of us were at a fundraising event for Visalia Emergency Aid Council that we prayed for Iris, and Iris is involved with them as their development director. And I know that we've all been involved with emergency aid a number of ways and in a number of times. I know many of you have volunteered there before, and that we've collected food donations for them at the Easter egg hunt that we've had the last few years. And so in a lot of ways, I know we've been involved with emergency aid. And this was one of their annual fundraising events, and Iris had asked if I would come and pray at that event. Officially, it was called an invocation, but whether it's an invocation or a prayer, I'm always a big fan of prayer in public spaces. And if I ever get a chance to pray in public spaces, I'm more than happy to take Jesus there and remind people that Jesus exists, even there. So it's interesting, though. I know everybody has a different take on invocations and prayers. At least my take is that when there's an opportunity to pray or invocate, that it's worth preparing for. I know some people do off-the-cuff prayers, and that's totally cool. It's totally fine. But at least for me, that's not the way that I've at least practiced some of these. So an interesting thing happened as I was preparing this week for that prayer. I was reading over some articles about emergency aid and its history, where it started in the 30s in the Dust Bowl and how it started, and the vision that some of those leaders had to feed the children and the families that were in that really tough situation right here where we live. And as I was reading articles about from then until now and how much the organization has changed and how leadership has changed and how they've weathered recessions and how they've they've expanded the work of emergency aid, how it's much bigger, and they supply food and clothing and other things for more and more families. It was one of those moments where you realize that this is a bigger deal than sometimes we just think it is. So as I'm thinking, and I'm kind of planning, and I'm praying about what to pray for this group that's gathered to raise funds, I had this feeling that for the work of this group, the stakes are high. This is big work. There's a lot riding on what's happening. And because I thought that, it changed the way that I prayed. And I know we often have those kinds of experiences where when we realize that the stakes are high, when what we're doing matters, it affects how we prepare or what we do in that time. We're trying to make decisions, or we're in this frustrating time of trying to figure it out, and we realize, oh wait, this really matters. This impacts people. This impacts things around me. And we realize, this is a big deal. I've got to do something about this. We have those times where we're preparing for a test, we're preparing for an exam or something coming up, and we realize, if I take this is significant. I've got to prepare well. So there's times, we all have them, when we realize this is important and the stakes are high. I think of coaches of pretty much every team before they go out on the field. And what does the coach do before the team goes out on the field? They give them a pep talk. And what does the coach want to create inside those players? They want to create this sense that in that game, in that moment, the stakes are high. Because that is the most important game of their season, their career. It's the most important time. And when they do that, when they instill that feeling that the stakes are high, that this is a big deal, it affects how the players play. What if the same is true as we step in and follow God? That we realize that when we follow God, the stakes are high. It can affect how we live and what we do. Take Joshua, for example. We've been looking through the book of Joshua for the past few weeks, a couple months maybe, and we've been looking at his story. And just to step back briefly to remind ourselves and get the stage, Joshua is about God's people coming into the promised land. That's the big story. And so it's about that season and those years when they are coming into the land. We looked at the first half of the book, which is them stepping into the land and what that looks like to cross over and come into the land and just do those beginning things. And that's that season that's marked by hope and excitement and miraculous things even that God did. Plus a little bit of setback and some challenges too along the way. But all in all, it was the first half is this exciting, this momentum building kind of a section about what God can do and people following God. Well, then we get to the second section, and we spent a couple weeks in that challenging section that most of us don't read very often at all, and we found some rich and some good things in that section. And that's the section when everybody gets their land. That's when they move in and they get their land and it's all divided up. And when they get their land, it looks basically like this. Everybody has their little spot, everybody has their territory. But what's interesting is that not everybody is together in the land. I mean, from the map, it looks like they all share their neat borders, and they're all supporting each other because they form a cohesive sort of unit, and it looks like they're all together, even though they each have their little piece, but they're all overall together. But they're not, because of what runs right down the middle. The Jordan River. The Jordan River is very narrow in some places and fairly wide in others, but it's the valley that is a huge divider between the groups. Here's a description of some of the valley. There may be something on the surface of another planet to match the Jordan Valley. There is nothing on this planet. No other part of our earth uncovered by water sinks to 300 feet below the level of the ocean. But here in the Jordan Valley, we have a rift more than 160 miles long and from 2 to 15 miles broad, which falls from the sea level to as deep as 1,292 feet below it at the coast of the Dead Sea, while the bottom of the sea is 1,300 feet deeper still. In this trench, there are the Jordan, a river nearly 100 miles long, and two Great Lakes that are 12 and 53 miles long. So what everyone referred to as the Promised Land was across the river. At the beginning of Joshua, the big deal is made for 3 chapters of them crossing the river, and when they cross the river, they get into the Promised Land. Well, wait a minute. What does that mean for the east side of the river? Are they not part of the Promised Land? Well, sort of. It kind of depends. I mean, they are, but they're not. Because, how does Reuben and Gad and part of Manasseh, how do they feel about this? They're kind of like second tier. They're on the fringe. They're sort of there, but not. And imagine if their border doesn't really share like the map shows. They've got miles between them and the real group out in the west. So there's a little bit of a lack of togetherness that's going on here. But despite this gap between them, there is surely no doubt about the Eastern folks and their dedication to God's work in the Promised Land. See, what happened in the beginning was when everybody was on this side of the river before they came across, these people settled in their land. So these people had their spots. When everybody crossed the river, these people sent all of their warriors, the men who were of age to fight, sent them across the river with all the other tribes. And when they did, they then fought the Battle of Jericho and the North Campaign and the South Campaign, and they did their tour, and they did all the things in the east. They left over on the west their wives, their children, and the people who weren't of age to fight. So they made a huge sacrifice. They sent all these people to go help the Western campaign while their families stayed back on the western side. So when all the fighting is done over here, some neat things happen. And, what does all this have to do with following God? Well, this is neat history and all, but it really does have some interesting things to do with what it means to follow God when the stakes are really high. So what happens is all the western stuff is all done. Everybody gets their land, and Joshua's ready to send them out. Here's what Joshua says to the people who are going back east to their land. He said, "Then Joshua called together the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and he told them, 'You have done as Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, and you have obeyed every order I have given you. During all this time, you have not deserted the other tribes. You have been careful to obey the commands of the Lord, your God, right up to the present day. And now the Lord your God has given the other tribes rest, as he promised. So go back to the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you as your possession on the east side of the Jordan River. But be very careful to obey all the commands and the instructions that Moses gave you. Love the Lord your God, walk in all his ways, obey his commandments, hold firmly to him, and serve him with all your heart and all your soul. So Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went home. Oh, what a charge! Go and obey, go into your land. This is exciting. This is their time to go back home, join their families, see them again. This is good. Until the western side gets a report that the eastern people have done something terrible. They have heard a report that as these people go back east, they have built a huge altar. And when they hear this, they get ready for war. They all gather together and they meet together and they agree that they need to go and attack their brothers and sisters for building this altar. Now, does that make sense? Does that warrant war against your own people? Yes, apparently it does. And the reason it does is because this was a really big deal. This was a huge deal that they had built this other altar. Because in their world, and in the way that they worshipped, and the way that they understood following God, they understood that there was one place, there was one altar, there was one worship center that they could go to. And they understood that if they were not there, then they were not worshiping. And at some point in their future, God spread them out and they could worship in other places. But the reason was, God wanted to make sure that they were all together, that they all knew what they were doing when they worshipped God, that their worship was pure, that it was right, and it wasn't messed up by the people that they were around, but it was pure, it was good. So God said, be central when you worship. Because when you do, I can make sure that it's right before you then fan out and then you can worship kind of on your own. So when the Western group hears this, they're like, no, worship must be right. It's got to be right. We've got to preserve this worship. You've got to worship in the right way, and you're not, and this is not right, so we're going to go to war with you. For them, they had that feeling. That feeling, the stakes are so high that we've got to worship God. And look what it did. It affected what they did. So they approached the Eastern group. But as we find out, the same is true. That same excitement, that same intensity is true for the Eastern group also. So the Western group goes out and they meet them. They meet them to confront them. And when they do, the Western group gives this huge speech, the how could you speech, the how dare you speech, this is not right speech. I mean, they laid it on them. This is going to affect all of us if you continue to do this. So stop what you're doing. Stop it now. Tear it down. Change your ways, because if you don't, we're all going to be affected. So here's what the Eastern group says in response to all these speeches. They say this. Say, the truth is, we have built this altar because we fear that in the future, your descendants will say to ours, what right do you have to worship the Lord, the God of Israel? The Lord has placed the Jordan River as a barrier between our people and your people, of Reuben and Gad. You have no claim to the Lord, so your descendants may prevent our descendants from worshiping the Lord. So, we decided to build the altar, not for burnt offerings or sacrifices, but as a memorial. It will remind our descendants and your descendants that we too have the right to worship the Lord at His sanctuary. It is a reminder of the relationship both of us have with the Lord. So that's why they did it. That's why they built the altar. It wasn't because they were going rogue against all the others. It wasn't because they were defecting. It wasn't because they didn't want to worship God anymore. It wasn't because they disagreed. It was because they wanted to protect this faith. They wanted to ensure that everybody knew who they were and what they were all about. They wanted to make sure that their relationship with God and their children, their children's children, understood what a relationship with God was all about. And it was so important that they stopped on their way, built this huge thing that was a memorial that everybody would see for the future to say, this is who we worship, and we worship God. For them, the stakes were high. They were so high that they were willing to build this huge thing and risk all this. It affected what they did. There are times, certainly for me, and I trust for you, that you have those moments where you realize what I'm doing. Sometimes we're in the middle of it and we realize, oh my goodness, what I'm doing, what I have ahead of me, is a huge deal. And it matters to a huge level. And we realize this is so important. And when we realize, you have that feeling that the stakes are, we have that kind of heart skip, that pit in our stomach, that realization, we realize this is a big deal and it can affect what we do. So what do we ask at a time like that? How do we know what to do? The question, I think, that is behind the Eastern and the Western groups and what made them do what they did, I think is a question that we can ask all the time, and I think it guarantees to impact what we do in those times. And the question is simply this: what can I do, or what can we do to be faithful? You know, when I don't know what to do, or this is a huge deal and it's intense, okay, what can I do to be faithful in this? Or how do I treat that person because they didn't treat me right? What can I do to be faithful? I mean, it makes us stop. It makes me stop and consider, who am I and what should I do? What's the wise way to go? I think the verses that Carmel read with the kids are very instructive. Let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep His promise. Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works, and let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now that the day of His return is drawing near. God has been faithful to you and me. What does it look like for us to be faithful in the times, especially the times where the stakes are high? Let's pray.